Hello and good morning. Welcome to our next episode of Moving the Needle on Wicked Problems. Today I am unfortunately flying solo because my co-conspirator in these podcasts, Paul, is under the weather and has to take care of himself. Today, we are going to talk about two issues that continue to plague our world. First, the ongoing war in Ukraine, and how countries, like minded countries who believe in the rule of law, can come together to help rebuild Ukraine and also hold Russia to account. The second issue is corruption. And I do think that oppression and corruption have always been linked. United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres has said that embezzlement, tax dodging, bribes, and payoffs worldwide cost roughly $3.6 trillion per year. Corruption is the grease that oils the wheels of the machinery of oppression and violation of human rights. So one can draw a sort of a straight line between aggression, corruption, human rights violations, and displacement. So there have been lots of calls for new tools, new ways of dealing with these wicked problems. Today, we're going to hear about a few of these tools from an extremely distinguished Canadian. I'm delighted to have him on our podcast. So without further ado, let's get to the interview. To delve into these ongoing wicked problems, we're talking to, in my view, one of the big legal and political minds in our country, Allan Rock. Allan is a preeminent lawyer. He's a former politician, a diplomat, and now a university administrator. He was Canada's ambassador to the United Nations and served previously in the cabinet of Prime Minister Jean Chrétien, most notably as Justice Minister and as Minister for Health. Amongst other roles today, Allan is currently the Chief Legal Advisor to the World Refugee and Migration Council. So thank you, Allan, for taking the time to speak to us today.
Senator, thank you for your generous words, and it's a pleasure to be here. I've enjoyed this podcast. I've seen some of your guests and past editions, and it's a terrific place to have a very useful conversation about the issues facing the country. So thank you for involving me here.
Oh, and my audience likely knows that Allan and I work very closely together on through the World Refugee and Migration Council. A lot of the efforts that I make in Parliament come from the thought leadership of Allan Rock and others like him. So for me, it's really like a special treat, Allan, to talk to you today. But I want to go back a little bit in your life. You know, you've held so many positions in Parliament, at the United Nations. I think of you as the quintessential servant of the public because you do this as a public service. So what motivated you and continues to motivate you?
Well, I started off practicing law, which I did for 20 years in Toronto, a big law firm at King and Bay. And I really enjoyed the practice of law. I was a trial lawyer, a litigator, and I loved the whole dynamic of being in the courtroom, making legal arguments, cross-examining. It was, to me, the dream of a lifetime to carry on that kind of practice. And I didn't actually end up in politics through a regular path. What happened is, in the early 90s, Debbie and I, my wife Debbie and I, we lived in Toronto in Etobicoke, a place what I eventually represented in Parliament. We became concerned about the state of the country and where we were going. If you may remember, the early 90s, it was a difficult time for Canada. We had 11.5% unemployment. We had massive annual deficits and a towering national debt. We had just entered into the free trade agreement with the US and Mexico, but without the kind of adjustment programs that would ease the transition to a different kind of economy. And of course, we had just come through the Meech Lake and Charlottetown catastrophes, which I think we believed imperiled Canadian unity to a degree we'd never seen before. At that time, we had young children. We had 3 kids under 10 in 1993. And we wanted to get involved in some way, but we also wanted to carry on our lives. And we had not been involved politically before that. We ended up joining the Liberal Party because they were the party not in power. They were the alternative. And our intention was to do some organizing for the expected candidate in our riding, who had run in the previous election, a great candidate. She did very well against Michael Wilson, who won, but just barely. Anyway, what happened, to make a long story short, is that candidate dropped out. She moved to Europe to pursue a career there. And the party eventually asked me to consider seeking the nomination. And I have to tell you, Senator, some of the most difficult months of my life were, as Debbie and I wondered what to do and whether we wanted to do that. It was in many ways the worst possible timing for us. We had just moved into a new house, as I said, we had young children. I was very happy in my practice. I'd just been elected head of the Law Society in Ontario. And eventually we decided we would seek the nomination. And that was a decision that I guess changed everything in my life. I then went on to, as you say, 10 years in government and a lot of other interesting challenges since. So it was an agonizing decision, but I look back on it now and I'm very glad that I made that. Debbie and I are both very grateful for the opportunities and experiences we've had to serve Canada in various ways.
Well, I think Canada is grateful to you for the public service. But as I hear you talking about this transformational decision you made with Debbie in the 1990s to enter into the world, the life of public service, I am reminded how we as Canadians don't completely understand the sacrifice that a politician makes. Politicians are not very positively viewed by our media, but being a parliamentarian today, I recognize that the sacrifice you make for the public needs to be acknowledged again and again. But in all these years of public service, there must have been a standout job. Which was the one you liked the most, that you enjoyed the most? And, Minister of Justice, Attorney General, UN Ambassador?
It was clearly the UN. I mean, I found the 10 years in the federal cabinet to be challenging, and I found the work to be fascinating, interesting, and I certainly felt very fortunate to have that position, to be at the table when the Prime Minister and the Cabinet were considering the great issues of the day, to have an opportunity to contribute to the making of policy. But on the other hand, getting to New York and sitting behind the Canada nameplate at the United Nations was a special thrill for me, an enormous thrill for me. I had grown up in a house where that symbol of the United Nations was present because my father, who spent his career in the Canadian Army, was sent to the Middle East in the early 60s as a member of Mr. Pearson's emergency peacekeeping force. And he was gone for 18 months. And, he came back with stories of what he was doing in the Middle East, the places he'd been, the tensions that he saw. But he also came back with that blue beret and that white symbol that he wore on his beret and on his uniform. And when I went into the General Assembly for the first time in New York and I saw that huge symbol towering over the assembly, it brought back so many memories of his service. And it made me feel in a way that I was continuing an effort that he'd started that many years ago. But the position at the United Nations, frankly, was the most memorable for me, the most enjoyable. I'll tell you why. It was political, but it wasn't partisan. And I'd never been comfortable with partisanship. I never heckled in Parliament. I found it it wasn't in my nature to go after the other side simply because they were in the other party. I wanted to have people come to the table and work together towards solutions. And I tried my best to do that as a minister. But in the United Nations, I found a political environment where you had to garner support and persuade people, but not a partisan one. And furthermore, speaking of media, there was little or no media attention. I mean, the way to clear a room is to talk about the United Nations. So I was left dealing with people literally from all over the world, working on issues that I felt were important. Many of them involved war and peace, major humanitarian concerns, getting countries to reconcile their differences. I found it fascinating, and I learned a great deal. And I found that, frankly, I was a better diplomat than I was a politician. I just took more naturally to it, and so I found that position extremely rewarding. And by the way, may I also say how impressed I was with the quality of our foreign service, the quality of the people who on Canada's behalf go out around the world, sometimes in very difficult and dangerous positions to represent our interests. So yeah, it was a wonderful experience, and I enjoyed every minute of it.
So let's stick with the UN, Alan. I mean, we find ourselves in really troubling times. You talked about the 1990s, and I feel almost nostalgic. The problems of the 1990s, maybe we just think of them as problems of the past that we've in one way or the other either resolved or set aside, Meech Lake being one of them. On the other hand, you look at the world order today, the chaos. We're just in such a troublesome time with what's happening between Israel and Hamas in the Middle East, between Ukraine and Russia in Europe, and many other hotspots I fear to come. Is the UN, in your view, still relevant, given the fact that the United Nations Security Council can't get its act together to pass resolutions anymore?
Well, the Security Council can't get its act together because one of the permanent members with the power of veto has violated the most fundamental principle of the UN Charter by marching across a border and using force in an act of illegal aggression to occupy territory. So yeah, it's what we Catholics call a mortal sin, and it's cast the Security Council into chaos. And since it is the most powerful entity in the UN system, it has endangered the capacity of the UN to do any good. But let me hasten to say that the United Nations is absolutely essential, and the more complicated and difficult the world becomes, the more important the UN is as the busiest intersection in the multilateral world, as the only place where every state on the planet has a seat. It has universal membership. It has global reach. And politically, it may be a mess, but don't forget the importance of the humanitarian role of the United Nations. It takes the lead in responding to catastrophes, whether they're earthquakes or tsunamis or global public health issues. The Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, UNICEF for children, UNHCR for refugees, the World Health Organization. I mean, it has so many dimensions of a humanitarian nature that are absolutely invaluable. So yes, the suits on First Avenue in New York may not be able to get their act together to do something productive in the Security Council, but on the humanitarian side, the UN continues to do work that is absolutely essential. And in terms of the United Nations Security Council, I believe that the current turmoil may finally be an impetus to meaningful reform of that body. You know, the Security Council has for decades lacked legitimacy because some of the biggest countries in the world, the most influential actors, are not members, are not permanent members. They have to be elected for 2-year terms occasionally. The Security Council permanent membership reflects the outcome of World War II, which is now 80 years ago. There has to be a place at the table for Brazil and for India and for other South Africa, Nigeria. And Canada has made proposals in that regard, but it's been very difficult to get consensus about change. I think the current circumstances may finally be the impetus to allow us to see that change affected. And I think Canada has an important role to play in inducing that change.
I hope you're right. I kind of worry about adding or replacing the United Nations Security Council with another body, because the world order is being frayed, and democracy as we know it is being challenged in major countries of democracy, such as India. I'm from India originally. It's not a democracy I recognize anymore. And I wonder about nation states being a member of, let's not think of it as the United Nations Security Council, but a broader group with more, opinions that fight with each other than align with each other. But that's a conversation for another day. Maybe we'll get back to it, and I can be persuaded on the point that more nation states should be allowed into the United Nations Security Council when at this point it's really not functioning. I want to shift our conversation to a region of the world that you and I are both very passionate and concerned about, and that is the Ukraine. The brutal war in Ukraine, the illegal aggression of Russia, the strength that Putin seems to display. The Russian economy has survived quite well, regardless of the sanctions and regardless of the freezing of its assets all over Europe. And there are signs of fatigue in Western countries. Just think of the United States, what the right-wing Republicans are saying. Some of that narrative is seeping into Europe, and Canada is also not completely immune from it. And we are, on a per capita basis, the largest donors to Ukraine. So what can the world do to ensure that the rights of the people of Ukraine prevail?
Well, it's hugely important that we maintain our strong support for Ukraine in its efforts. It's hugely important that under the leadership of President Biden, we keep the alliance between North America and NATO together, that we be seamless in our approach, that the European Union stands with Canada and the United States, civilized regimes everywhere in support of Ukraine. It's been said before by so many, better than I can say it, Senator, but it's not just Ukraine's war. We all have a huge stake in the outcome. There is nothing less at stake than the fundamental principles of the global order. If we allow Putin to succeed in a blatant act of illegal aggression to take over the territory of another state, then we are in essence forfeiting the fundamental principles of the UN Charter, the rule of law, the rules-based order, everything that's kept us safe and sane these last 80 years. So there's a huge amount at stake. And by the way, allowing Putin to get away with this, not fighting back effectively, would also encourage China and others who have ambitions for the territory of other states. So I think what we must do is continue the effort of advocacy to persuade our global publics of the importance of sustained support for Ukraine. This is not an act of charity, and it's not just doing something for a foreign power. This is something that's very much in our self-interest. We can't be there with boots on the ground for reasons we all understand. But we must be there with the munitions and the money and the other support that Ukraine needs to sustain and to prevail in its war efforts. And I know the government of Canada is keenly aware of that. We've been some of the strongest, most consistent supporters. And among other things, we have up to 1 million people in Canada of Ukrainian heritage, a proud part of the Canadian mosaic, who've made enormous contributions to this country. And we stand with them as together we stand with Ukraine against this naked act of aggression. It's just too important for us not to do our part. And we hope we can bring the Americans along as well with current issues in Israel. As we speak, Hamas has just a few days ago committed that horrific and barbaric invasion of civilian areas in southern Israel. America is now shipping munitions to assist Israel in its response, and I hope that that does not become a distraction which will reduce or diminish the West's support for Ukraine.
That is an extremely astute observation, because all of a sudden our attention shifts from one troubled spot to another.
Yeah.
When we really need to sustain our efforts in Ukraine for our own interest, as well as obviously that of the Ukrainians. You talked about munitions, and the work that you've done on repurposing frozen assets, seizing them and repurposing them is kind of a weapon we have. It's a soft weapon, a weapon that Canada has embraced. But the real money lies in state bank assets, Russian state bank assets, $300 billion spread around the world, mainly in Europe. What do you think Canada should do about Russian state assets, although we've taken some, important steps on seizing oligarch assets? What do you?
Well, to answer that, I have to go back in time a bit to 2017, when the World Refugee and Migration Council, chaired by my friend and former colleague Lloyd Axworthy, was looking at the state of forced displacement around the world, refugees and internally displaced persons. And one of the things that we observed as we went around the world to places where there were large numbers of refugees or internally displaced is that the funding to support them was chronically low. We dealt with UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, and found that only 35% of what they asked for in terms of budget was being provided every year. These are voluntary contributions. So if countries have other calls on their treasury, they diminish their contributions to UNHCR. So we recommended that every step be taken to increase funding to support refugees until they could be resettled successfully. And one of the things we recommended was that when a country like Canada freezes the assets of a foreign kleptocrat, then we should not only freeze the amounts, we should also confiscate and repurpose them for the benefit of refugees. And the example we gave was our trip to Colombia, when we saw so many Venezuelan refugees, overwhelming the capacity of Colombia to respond with housing and social services and healthcare and education. And we said, look, if the Maduro regime from Venezuela, corrupt and incompetent as it is, has stolen money from the Venezuelan treasury and has it on deposit in Canada, we should not only freeze that money, we should seize it, and we should use it for the benefit of the Venezuelan refugees created by Maduro, who are now trying to survive in Colombia, Peru, Ecuador, Brazil. So that's the recommendation we made. And by the way, at the time, Government of Canada was interested, but not really prepared to move on it. And here's where I must express my gratitude and admiration to you, Senator, as a member of the World Refugee and Migration Council. You introduced a private member's bill in the Senate called what was it called?
Frozen Assets Repurposing Act.
That's right.
I will go to my grave remembering.
FARA, exactly right. And, it succeeded. It got through the third reading in the Senate and was about to be introduced in the House when the Government of Canada, in the context of Ukraine, took another look at this concept. And they introduced legislation of their own in June of 2022, which amended legislation here in Canada, allowing the Government of Canada to confiscate and repurpose frozen assets. And they had Ukraine in mind, but it isn't limited to Russia and Ukraine. So It was a great breakthrough, and your contribution was enormous in that effort. The private members bill that you introduced, the way that you raised awareness of the concept, you gave us a platform to explain it, to respond to concerns and criticisms, and you really paved the way for the legislation introduced by the government. So yes, it is a weapon, it's a tool, it's an instrument. And as we look at what's going on now in Ukraine, as we look at the weakening, as we've just described, of the support for continued munitions and money for Ukraine, it's all the more important that we look to other sources, all sources of financing the effort. And by the way, compensating and providing for the reconstruction of Ukraine afterwards. So that's why you and I and many of us are advocating that not only Canada, but the G7 and indeed the Western world should use frozen assets, Russian assets, state and private, for the purpose of contributing to the compensation and reconstruction of Ukraine for the enormous damage done by Putin. I believe that such measures can be taken in a fashion that's consistent with international law. I believe that it's the natural and just way of dealing with present circumstances. I also believe that taxpayers in Canada and the United States are going to balk if they're asked to pay for the reconstruction of Ukraine. Those who are responsible should pay. And that's why the international concept of reparations was created. And so I believe the effort that Canada is leading is a worthy one, a crucial one, and we're anxious to see other countries follow our lead.
So when I talk to people in the know about the Frozen Assets Repurposing Act, the hurdle it's run into in terms of state bank assets, and just for the audience to describe it to you very briefly, audience, Canada is able to seize the assets of oligarchs, but when state assets are involved, the State Sovereign Immunity Act kicks in. In other words, we are not able to seize state bank assets in the same way as we're able to seize oligarch assets. So Allan and Lloyd and Fenn and Rob Curry, all, thought leaders in this field, have proposed another avenue, which I have adopted and will be introducing in the Senate shortly next week. It's been introduced already. I'll be speaking to it. It sort of finds another way to seize state assets. The question I get asked is, Canada already has the ability to seize state assets through the laws of countermeasures, as you've spoken about. Why do we need to strengthen our ability to do what you're proposing to do by enacting domestic legislation?
Well, the statute that was adopted by Parliament last year creates a pathway, certainly for private Russian assets, the oligarchs, for example. There are Russian oligarchs who have assets in Canada, whether cash or property or shares in businesses. And the legislation of last year creates a pathway for the lawful confiscation and repurposing of those assets through an application to the court, a making of a court order, and subsequent action by government. The difficulty presented by that is that the Sovereign Immunity Act protects other jurisdictions from the jurisdiction of our courts. And the whole idea is that states ought not to be at the mercy of court decisions around the world that might find them liable or award damages or in other ways affect their rights. States have immunity from the court jurisdiction in other countries. And yet the legislation of last year specifically provided for a court-based process. So what international law provides, although it seems artificial, it seems also to be very solid as a principle of international law. Sovereign immunity is not triggered if the action of confiscation is triggered by executive decision as opposed to a court process. So in the United States, the president is authorized by executive powers to seize, for example, the assets of Iraq in the context of the war that was waged there, or Iran in the context of the declaration of Iran as a state sponsor of terrorism. But those countries are immune if the courts make that order. And as I say, this may sound cute or artificial, but it's not. This is real. So talking about executive action to confiscate and repurpose is a crucial distinction. And by the way, let me acknowledge that there's international law scholars are not unanimous about all of this. There are varying viewpoints, and I have great respect for some of my colleagues in international law who believe the opposite. But my own conclusion, based on research and also I think a growing consensus, is that there is indeed a lawful basis for states to confiscate Russian bank state assets and repurpose them for reconstruction in Ukraine. And I think that growing consensus is getting stronger by the month. I think a lot of countries, for example, the European Union and the United States, I think are taking a close second look at this after first expressing reservations and caution. And I think there's a growing consensus among international scholars that there is a pathway by which this can be done lawfully. So, and Canada's been a leader in all of that.
Agreed. Canada has been a leader. I think this is the space we uniquely occupy. We may not, in fact, have the value of state bank assets that would make a dent in Russia's financial situation. But if we do something and the United States joins us, and then the UK joins us, and members of the EU join us, then we have a rolling stone that can gather moss. And it all started with Allan Rock and others like him. Thank you, Allan, so much for your time today. You've left us with lots to think about. And to my listeners, I will direct you to the website of the World Refugee and Migration Council for more in-depth analysis. We've given you a taste of what they say, what they think, what they write. And if you want more and you want to talk to them, please go ahead. And please also don't forget to write to me if you have an interesting topic you'd like us to explore. Better still, if you have a candidate we can talk to. That also helps. Thank you all, and goodbye for today.
Thank you, Senator.